Thank you very much. And yeah, we will stay for the next 3 hours you told me that I have right now. So bear with me for the following presentation. First of all, thank you very much for the kind invitation to be here. As Steve mentioned, this is a topic that really calls a lot of passion when I discuss about energy modeling. I've been doing modeling for the last 15 years, probably more now. I'm focusing on energy planning since 2016 when I went back to Costa Rica after my PhD and postdoc in Manchester University, where I started some uncertainty modeling. Maybe the most common uncertainty model that you may have ever heard about is Monte Carlo. You know, when we think about uncertainty, we immediately think of Monte Carlo running the model several thousands of times and then getting something out of it and trying to understand what could happen. Problem is that Monte Carlo is quite handy when we do understand how the future may evolve, how we parameterize those uncertainties. Are they gamma? Are they beta? Are they just a random Gaussian model? But the question now is, how do we plan for climate strategies? Because we don't know how things may evolve from now on. And those are called deep uncertainties, something that we may discuss the whole day how they may happen in the future, but we will never agree. Can we agree what is the cost of oil in 2050? No, because we just don't know what is going to happen in the current geopolitical situation. So that is a deep uncertainty. And therefore, we cannot really characterize those probabilities in the future because we just don't know. So we must treat them as everything can happen and nothing can happen, right? So the presentation is more challenge for everybody to think beyond the typical planning that we are doing and start planning for a future that we cannot predict. And to start and to begin with this presentation, I want to maybe spice up a little bit the presentation and ask you these three key questions. And I'm going to link it to this amazing presentation Abby did yesterday about TZ. I'm going to use it because I admire the work they are doing. But one of the key questions we always ask is, how many scenarios do we use in this planning? One. Abby said yesterday, 3. Up, the middle, and down. Okay, pessimistic, the most likely, and the optimistic scenario. And we normally take the most likely scenario and we go ahead. Even Bernard presented this morning one potential evolution of the electricity system in South Africa. But that is if we do have a clear understanding of the future, which we don't, right? How do we capture what stakeholders actually need from the analysis? Because we think as an analyst that we can support that policy process, but are we really capturing the questions? Because in my experience, working with more than 15 Latin American Caribbean countries, we always hear questions like, what is going to be the GDP of my country in 2050? What is going to be the number of jobs created and unfortunately destroyed by this transition? How is it going to be the energy mix in the future? The question is not how much solar do I need to install, because that's a question from the Minister of Energy and perhaps the planner. But the president is asking me, I need to gain votes, because in 4 years when I move out, my party needs to continue in power. So how do we translate all this amazing analysis that we are doing into meaningful insights for a policymaker? That's one key question, and we need to listen to these stakeholders. Last question is, how do you know that your strategy holds in the future if this one surprises you? You know, we are planning for current oil prices, but in 1 year, we just don't know what USA may do. And then prices explode again, you know. We had it in 2022 when Russia invaded Ukraine. We saw natural gas just boom, blowing. We can see it now as well with USA, Israel, and Iran situation currently as we speak. So what is going to be next year? I just don't know. So is my model representing those deep uncertainties? Well, if not, we should start doing so. And this is the problem, and I think we have gone thoroughly through this. We normally forecast what can happen. You know, we forecast demand, and demand grows. GDP is an input parameter to our model projection. We assume that GDP will grow 3, 4, 5%, and demand projection, boom, that's an input. That's an exogenous input to our model. And then our model, which is built by analysts most of the time using inputs and best data that is available in most of the cases, and then we do the output, expansion, and so on and so on. That's typical situation. But one of the challenges, we are optimizing for one future. And this is what we are calling the most likely future, right? We are not really stress testing this potential future. There is no building way to find the conditions that break that strategy. What could go wrong? And if it does happen, how do we counteract those potential risks of that transition? Because this then associates to risk. And I'm going to go deep into risk as we move on. Sometimes the stakeholders do not validate this because it is, I'm not saying this audience because this audience has been working in stakeholder engagement for a while, but this is typically many other exercises that I've seen. Stakeholders only receive a final product. This is the transition that we recommend because my model is optimizing for the best future possible. And the stakeholders have to somehow accept that scenario. And it doesn't work like that. Normally, those reports, beautiful, end up in just, cabinet, back in the maybe early 2000s. Nowadays, in a share folder in SharePoint, you know, and it's not really used for policy making, okay? And the last one is deep uncertainty. This is not really being captured, but I think I had already mentioned enough this. So deep uncertainty, I have mentioned a few, and I think I could list a few here in technology. The range of solar, we were discussing before the deployment of solar, utility scale or rooftop solar in South Africa. But that is assuming that the cost of that technology may evolve as we think today may evolve, based on availability of critical minerals, based on the deployment of China developing solar panels today. But what is it going to happen in the next 5, 10 years, 20 years? Because we are doing planning to 2050. It's 2050. This is 23 years ahead. I'm excluding 2026 because it's kind of, we consider this year kind of uncertain, still uncertain, but not deep uncertain. Commodities, they could just explode any moment. Oil reserve. Venezuela holds a third of the oil reserve of the world and was invaded in early this year, in February, when Nicolas Maduro, the president, whoever, right? I'm not going into those politics discussions. I may need a couple of drinks for that. But USA took president and now is managing reserves in Venezuela. A third of the oil reserve in the world, okay, according to International Energy Agency. What is going to happen from now on? Climate. We just don't know how temperature might also change. We are talking about 1.5, 1.8, 2.0, but how is it going to be really? And that does affect resource availability. When we talk about hydropower plants, in Latin America, we had a quite massive draw in 2023, and the whole system, as you may know, Latin America has a very high installed capacity of hydropower plants. Paraguay runs 100% on hydropower plants. Costa Rica, 70%. Panama, 40%, okay, and so on. So when that happened, we need diesel. So we started buying diesel from different countries, and we burned diesel all 23, 24, which you can see actually in emissions in all these countries spike in 2024. And we just don't know how that may affect in the future. And governance. One of the massive challenges I have faced in my life is discussing with governments how we do long-term planning when they are only in the president or in the power for the next 4 or 5 years. Because they only care about the short-term actions, and the long-term that's not my problem. I need to do something 3 years, 4 years, 5 years, So my party continues in the power for the next 4 years and so on. So that long-term vision is always quite challenging to agree with stakeholders. And I like this phrase that Robert Lempert, Stephen Popper, and Banks put in 2003 when robust decision-making was born. They said, rather than seek the optimal strategy for the most likely future, which we don't know, seek the strategy that performs acceptably well across the widest range of plausible futures. Something that, if things change in the future, I will still gain. Maybe the gains will be small, but I will still gain. Because I don't want a future that I start moving the electricity system and then electricity prices become higher. That's going to cause a massive riot to some extent, right? So we need to plan something that will work. We'll lower electricity tariff by 2050, but maybe not as much as we would love to. But if it lowers the tariff, then we are in a good shape as a country. So just a little bit about what then robust decision-making aims to do. We do aim to co-create with the stakeholders. So we do have different workshops with the stakeholders where we listen to what they want. We map this into something called the XLRM matrix, which is an instrument we created to capture deep uncertainties. Those are the X, and I'm going to go into the details in the next slide. Policy levers that we want to play with, data and tools that are available in the country, because also sometimes, in my experience, we go to this country and they may have an amazing tool that has been developed over the last 10 years or so, and then we want to introduce our new model. That's challenging, because that model has already been in the country for quite some time, and we are just planning to build a new tool for the country. So the trust, all that capacity needs to be rebuilt, and that takes time. So instead of perhaps developing a new tool, can we use what is available in the country that already has certain credibility for the stakeholders? That's one of the key things that we also promote in robust decision-making. Scenario-based exploration. Instead of focusing on one potential evolution of the system, we explore thousands of possible evolutions, where we permutate different parameters of our model. Everything that we probably input into our model are assumptions. The cost of commodities, the prices of different commodities in our country, if we are capturing taxes there. The cost of technologies, okay? The demand, the GDP that will trigger the demand, the population growth. Those are inputs typical to our models. Then we start looking at robust as opposed to optimal. Instead of optimizing for one possible future, we just explore robustness across different plausible futures. And then through the development of multiple metrics, we understand when those futures may perform well and when they will not perform well. How? Because the stakeholder in the first workshop told me, I want to see how many jobs we are going to create from this. I want to see how the GDP may actually evolve in time. I want to see what is going to be the installed capacity. I want to see how much investments we need here, but also how much we are going to save from oil. Because a country moving away from oil imports is going to save in the oil bill. So therefore, those savings could be reused to pay the capex that we need to enable the transition. So all these things are typical inputs from the Minister of Finance as well. Just a little bit about how this has evolved. RDN is not new, so this is not something we are just creating now. Actually, it started in 1962. Wasn't used for climate or energy planning. Actually, it was used for war. Then in 2003, Lempert and Stephen Popper started using this for planning long-term scenarios, particularly water in Latin America and the Caribbean. This is coming from RAND Corporation, which is it's a think tank based in California, and they started using RDN to explore these uncertainties. Then different partners had been developing this or adopting this methodology. back in Costa Rica when I moved in 2016 from the UK to Costa Rica. We started using the tool at the University of Costa Rica that then spun off a think tank called Climate Lead Group. And we have deployed this in more than 10 countries. The first one was Costa Rica, so the first country that used robust decision-making for climate strategies was Costa Rica, when we assessed the cost and benefits of the national decarbonization plan, but then follow Peru, Colombia, Chile, Dominican Republic, Jamaica, and others. And since 2025, when I moved back to the UK, to the nice weather in the UK, we have started using this in Botswana with colleagues present here, as well as in Uganda, to develop their national, long-term national strategy, as well as the updating of the NDCs in Uganda. The core logic. So what does RDN really aims to do? We first aim to explore. We then discover how things may evolve in future, and then we do design with the stakeholders. We'll not go into the details, but the first block is very, very, very important from my perspective, and is define the XLRM metrics with the stakeholders. This is really what we want to capture from this analysis. You know, it's not the analyst team telling the government what they have to do. It's understanding what they want to do and then feeding back the discussion with science, with models. You know, maybe we hear from the stakeholder, oh, we want to deploy, I don't know, nuclear. Okay, have you thought of the potential challenges, cost, risk, and so on? Maybe there are better alternatives, maybe not. Maybe it's a right decision from the policymaker. You know, natural gas, same. You know, countries are discussing natural gas as a transition fuel. Fine, let's explore what it's going to cost, what are the risks associated to this transition. Are you going to end up in stranded assets by 2050 if you are aiming to reach net zero by 2050, and so on. So it's listening, don't inform yet the discussion, analyze with the different tools that will need to be developed, and then feedback the discussion. Then discover. We use different algorithms, and these are the patient rule induction method, or PRIN, that helps really peeling away good futures to find failure clusters. So those simulations that we do from the thousands that may end up in bad metrics, those are the futures that we might be interested more than the others. We want to understand what is going to break my strategy. If we understand what is going to break my strategy, I can then plan counteracting measures, because I am planning ahead. I am anticipating those risks. You know, if we move away from coal, for instance, to natural gas, as it was the case of Dominican Republic, which I am going to mention later, they wanted to understand, we want to move away from coal and deploy natural gas. What are the risks of that? Stranded assets, but also the cost of the commodity in 2030, 2050. So we did design the long-term strategy specifically for the electricity sector in Dominican Republic. The report is publicly available, and it was funded by the Inter-American Development Bank. The only bad news is that the report is in Spanish, so you may need AI to translate everything. That's one of the challenges in Latin America. I mean, everything is publicly available in Spanish. But nowadays, we just bunch this into ChatGPT or any other AI, and you translate this, and you get the report back in English. It's not good English, though, but good enough. And then designed, when we understand what could break my strategy, I could then design the roadmap for that strategy and the deployment in the country. That sounds very simple. You know, explore, discover, and design sounds very simple. It does take time, as colleagues actually from Botswana and Uganda could confirm. But just maybe a couple of key aspects of the RDN is this one. The first one is the XLRM. We do co-create the problem. We don't design the problem. It's not the analyst team designing the problem. It's co-creation with the stakeholders. What are the exogenous uncertainties? What are the policy levers that we want to explore? deployment of renewables, electrification of the fleet, reforestation when we think about economy-wide transformations, waste management as well. We had not discussed here yesterday or today waste, but it's a big issue worldwide. So how do we really capture all these aspects? What models, what data is available in the country? Because when we use data from local stakeholders, we also create that trust. They're going to trust the data that is locally available more than the international data. It's a fact. This is not Jairo saying this. It's a fact. You build on something that is available in the country. Challenge is that the data may not be available. So sometimes we need to agree with the stakeholders what data is going to be used. So is it acceptable to use International Energy Agency data or maybe African data that is available? And we, to some extent, match that to the specific country we are working with. And then the metrics of success. This is not we saying what we want to produce or what we can produce from our models. We need to think out of this box and design metrics that will be of interest. CO2 equivalent is always a metric of interest when we talk about climate transition, for sure. This is the key question from the Minister of Energy. But the Minister of Finance will be asking for the net economic benefits. So how is it going to be the financial implications or the economic implications of this transition? This needs to be answered in all these spaces. Jobs, energy access. Countries had also set up some ambitious energy access. We then deploy something called a scenario discovery. So I will not go into the nitty-gritty of a scenario discovery, but it's something that after running the several thousands of simulations, we can use some algorithms, advanced algorithms, to understand how my outputs are performing, whether they are performing well or bad, according to those metrics. If we defined that a country must perceive a net benefit after this transition, that's a metric of success. So we can exclude all the simulations that are leading to a net cost for the country. And that could be a key metric of assessment here. This also needs to be assessed with the different stakeholders. So we don't do this in one go. We do iterate with the stakeholders through national workshops. We recommend at least 3 workshops. The first one to understand what they want to do. The second one to capture how we are progressing. Our simulations, are they doing well? Are they capturing what you told me in the first workshop? Sometimes they feedback the discussion. Sometimes we are even missing data, and we do know what data is needed. After running the simulations, we are like, oh, I'm pretty sure about this, but I really need to confirm this with the stakeholders. So in the second workshop, you can focus your questions to the stakeholders on, look, there are many questions, but I want to focus on this. I'm really struggling to understand this and this and this and this. And that could be a really nice second workshop that you co-create with the stakeholders, and they also gain trust in the analysis you are developing as opposed to, boom, this is what I did, take it or leave it. And the final workshop, which is a final presentation of everything that had been done, plus some insights that you may also want to gather from that final sprint that we normally perform at the very end. So that co-creation for me is key. We have been doing this in several countries. It's quite intensive for those that have been doing stakeholder engagement. It's quite tiring because you have to really be 10 minutes, but Steve told me 3 hours. So I've been talking for 2 hours and 50. Okay. What I was saying, stakeholder engagement is quite intensive, but it's also quite interesting to see different perspectives from stakeholders. We iterate and we redesigned, so I'm going to jump this. For those that may be interested in my previous job at Climate Lead Group, we put a 10-step practitioner's guide. So if you want to go into the details more, like a recipe, we try to put a recipe. I love eating, not cooking, but I love eating. I do cook well barbecue. So for those that like barbecue, we can do something at some point. But we put a recipe. If you want to do this, we recommend, based on more than 10 implemented countries, we recommend following these steps in your country if you want to do this. So the guide is publicly available. We actually developed that with the 2050 Pathways platform. And you can follow the recommendations there. Just to start wrapping up, this has been implemented in Costa Rica, the first one, where after doing that analysis and linking to Steve's comment before, this is where the data to deal framework started to evolve. So we worked with the president of Costa Rica and the line ministers in 2018 to develop the National Decarbonization Plan of Costa Rica that aims to reach net zero by 2050. We did have all these workshops, the analysis, the implementation, and so on. And after the whole assessment, many financiers started approaching the country and say, well, look, this process was very robust. So I do trust the analysis. I know it's based on science. It's opened. We know that stakeholders are also willing to deploy this plan because they co-created the plan, and therefore I'm happy to fund this project, and this project. So that help, when we documented the case study in Costa Rica, help mobilizing $2.4 billion US from different financiers, IDB, World Bank, French Development Agency, GCF, and others funded parts of those implementations, projects, programs that were put in place. We did something similar in Dominican Republic. Was very intensive, actually. It was in the electricity sector, and those that had worked in electricity sector is very data intensive because we have been collecting data for the electricity sector for the last 15 years or so. And also the expertise in the sector is quite advanced. So the discussions were fascinating. And also the discussion was around how do we phase out coal-fired power plants, which as many of us know, is a quite challenging discussion always. So we actually, in Dominican Republic, documented $6.5 billion US of finance mobilized, most of it private capital. Just to go a little bit deep into the Costa Rican case study, and I hope I will have the time to do that. But we developed an osmosis-based model. The model represented the energy sector. This is focused on the energy sector, by the way. We represented the energy sector in detail, and we wanted to map different policy targets that the country was willing to set up. After deploying our best guess of the future, we found that energy transition will lead to a net economic benefit of almost $18 billion US. So, these are paying the capital expenditure, additional capital expenditure with respect to a BAU scenario. So we will need to invest almost 8 billion. Sorry, this says mil, but is translated to English is billion. Almost 8 billion more than the BAU. So yeah, we need more capex to enable that transition. But the savings in oil bill by 2050 will be equal to $11 billion US. So there, the financial benefit is already evident, about $3 billion US, more or less. You do the math. And then when we add up the core benefits of the transition, which are health, if we lower emissions, people can breathe better. If we lower the congestion in Costa Rica, which is crazy, we could also increase the productivity of the country, which will also have some cascading effects in the rest of the economy. You could mobilize products and goods quicker, which consequently should lower the bill for everybody, for all the customers. And also the accidents. Okay, so having less cars, more buses to mobilize people will lower the number of accidents that we have in the system, and therefore the cost of health associated to those accidents. So these are co-benefits that we are also capturing in this analysis. We ran the model 1,000 times, and maybe just to demystify one comment from yesterday, the models can be a little bit slow. But actually, with the science and the algorithms that we do have today, 5 minutes, 2:55, okay. With the algorithms that we do have today, we have gone from 4 hours to perform 1,000 simulations to 10 minutes. So I think technology is advancing a lot. So this, yes, is computationally expensive, but technology is progressing so much. High-performance computing is there, so running this in parallel is also possible, and we could definitely lower the computation time of these simulations to a couple of minutes. So I think there is possibility to really deploy this. As I said, we ran this 1,000 times, and then we sorted from the most beneficial to the more expensive scenario in this graph, and we said, look, we really want to understand when this is going to be expensive. You know, all the right-hand side graph that you see there that we call positive net financial cost for Costa Rica. And we use first some simple algorithms, and we noticed that higher increases in freight transport cost, as well as not cost savings from private transport, the four wheels, will be the main reason why the national decarbonization plan may not perform well in the future. But we make it a little bit complex, and sorry, I know it's a very complex graph, but I just wanted to scare you all with this one. We put everything into this scatter plot, and we said, okay, let's find the vulnerabilities of this plan. We map here the cost of the heavy freight, the cost of the four-wheelers, and the demand that is growing in the freight sector. And we said, tell me this scenario discovery algorithm. I'm happy to go into the details in another space, maybe in the tables that Steve been mentioning for lunch. How we do this, we use this scenario discovery, and we said, tell me when this is not performing well. And we actually, after performing this, we found the vulnerabilities, 3 concurrent vulnerabilities of this plan are the changing cost of electric private vehicles must be higher than 43% negative. So we need to make sure that the cost of the private vehicles, ICEVs, remains high, okay? Maybe through taxes. We don't discuss the policy instruments, just the policy actions, okay? Whether this is done through taxes, import tax, or maintenance tax, or whatever, that's a follow-up discussion. The changing cost of hybrid heavy freight transport must not be higher than minus 33%, okay? This may sound a little bit complex, but this is what is coming out of the analysis, and we are going to translate that into policy in the next slide. And the changing demand for heavy freight must be higher than 50%. And when these 3 concurrent conditions happened, we can explain 85% of those positive net financial costs. So if you want to understand the risk of the plant, in 85% of the cases, these 3 conditions hold, which is quite interesting when we do deploy this. And then how do we translate this for a president, for a policymaker? Then we put, these are the 3 recommendations that came out of the analysis to the policymaker. The 3 concurrent conditions that must hold: heavy freight demand not too high, so we need to deploy more logistical and new business model for logistics because they keep growing, you know. Lower cost of hydrogen heavy freight vehicles, so make sure that the cost reductions are below 16%. Cost of four-wheel carbon-based private vehicles not too low, so make sure that this cost reduction not higher than 14% of current values. So those are policy recommendations that we can tell our line ministers to deploy. And as I said, we are now implementing this in Botswana for the long-term strategy and Uganda for the NDC 3.0. We are following very similar analysis, deploying sectoral models, doing robust decision-making, and also building capacity in the local teams. So this analysis can be performed by the local teams. In this case, colleagues from the transition think tank here, being able to execute this analysis when another policy question arises. Just to wrap up, final messages, I promise. What are the end delivers for decision makers? We could design NDCs and long-term strategy targets grounded in evidence. Investment priorities backed by trade-off analysis. We do need to understand that this perfect future does not exist, but a future with trade-off is there. We need to find that. We need to find those trade-offs. risk-aware strategies that survive surprises. We just don't know what the future holds. So can we anticipate those risks? National ownership through participatory design. This is a very co-creative process, highly participatory, and that builds trust in the analysis. We were talking about black boxes, which I don't think it is, by the way. I do know that the osmosis and pipes codes are publicly available and so on. But when we engage iteratively in the process, we naturally learn and transfer the capacity to different stakeholders. We are using the local data. They can see how we input that into the analysis and so on, and that increases the ownership of the process. And with that, I'm going to close, and thank you very much.
Thank you. That was enlightening. Thank you very much. And the R in RDM is really important, because in my experience, political decisions, the R stands for random. But I'm very pleased that we can turn it into robust. Any questions for Jairo? There's one here. Bearing in mind that we're going to run into tea a little bit, but we're pulling back on that 15 minutes, so I appreciate it. So one here and one here, and Emily, and that'll be our 3. And then for lunch, there are now 3 tables. There's an RDM table, there's a PhD, in power systems table, there's a finance table, and then importantly, picking up on Jairo's comment on the glass of wine, there's a slightly tipsy political economy dinner.
Wow.
Thank you.
Thanks, Jairo. So interesting as always. I have 2 questions. One is, on the slide where you presented how many different futures you want to simulate, you were saying, 1,000, potentially around 1,000 futures. So to be able to simulate those many futures, your model would have to be quite simple, because the more complex it gets, the longer the model takes to run. So how do you find that balance between having a simple model that you can run many times versus having a very complex model that you can only run a few times? So finding that balance. And the second question is, whenever I see robust decision making being presented, whenever you've presented, I feel like everyone agrees with it. No one, it's not controversial. Everyone agrees that this is a more sensible way to go. But why do you think it's not being taken up as much as it should be? Like, what do you think are the real challenges, maybe logistical challenges or other challenges that are preventing people from this becoming mainstream?
Let's take another question.
Yeah, thank you. Great presentation, as always. I just wanted to understand how you account for the interrelationships between uncertainties and then possibly feedback loops as you move forward in the modeling period with those sort of compounding uncertainties.
Good question.
Thanks. Yes, fascinating presentation. Just two questions, and I think one might be anticipating some of the challenges, but I wondered if you can comment on the skills that you require in your team to do this, because it must be quite cross-cutting, and how you assemble a team. And then probably what Steve might have in mind, have you operated, in any of these contexts, have there been like really contested, divided stakeholders, and how have you dealt with that?
Nice questions. I think we can go with these 3.
Yep.
Just to, I didn't bring any pen, so I'm gonna. So the computational, yes. So I think there is a trade-off. In Dominican Republic, we did a model for the electricity sector, and we connected actually with a hourly based model up all the way to 2050. So as you may anticipate, very detailed model running 8,760 hours per year from 2022 to 2050. And that was computationally expensive. What we did back in those days, in 2022, when we didn't have perhaps HPEC, was to focus on the yearly analysis within the RDM. And then when we wanted to stop the simulations and go into the details of how the operation might perform, then we just pull back the detailed model and run the simulations for that specific year. Now in Uganda and Botswana, the models are detailed enough, but we are using HPCs to run this. And as I said, the model is now I think 100 simulations that we are performing right now. Just we don't start with thousands at once, because why would you run thousands and then something may fail? There is a calibration process in between, which I didn't go into the details, but as any model, there is a calibration process in between. And we are at the moment with 100 simulations, and this is taking 10 minutes. So the model, because we can parallelize the model, we have 54 cores, and osmosis can actually be running cores. So 54, we are using 50, 100 simulations is like performing 2 serious simulations, 50 in parallel. So it's like parallel computing that is out there, so we need to explore how to deploy. So I think the trade-off will now be executing the models. If it's taking 4 hours, yes, we may need to downgrade a couple of things. But again, this type of analysis does not aim to answer the specifics. This type of analysis aims to define strategic decisions at the policy level. Operation aspects, those might be for the TSO people that we are quite geek on that. I used to work in the system operator in Costa Rica after I finished my degree, I moved to the operator and ran away because it's too boring sometimes, operating the system, maybe moving some levers. But again, like doing that detailed analysis may need an extra layer. So I'm happy to explore potentially. I would love to discuss with you how TZ could potentially deploy this. Very happy to explore collaboration there. Was that the only question?
Why the challenges?
Oh yeah, the challenge, which links a little bit to the capacity. That's definitely one of the key challenges, finding this capacity, and that's why we've been developing a very simple. Actually, Conrad present here has been looking at something we call the RDN interface, which is a spreadsheet that gathers all the information that you need to run your RDN simulations. So it's a very relatively easy way to interface with all the science that is behind the RDN code. And we actually make one paper publicly available, so it's in GitHub again. So if you want to look at the code, is available. And it's improving every time we find new ways to improve it. And actually, like a month ago, we went from 4 hours to 10 minutes because we deployed some algorithms that will speed up things massively, like massively. Another potential challenge is how we present the results to policymakers. As you saw at some point, the visualizations may be a little bit complex, I must recognize. And I said, I put that one just to scare everybody because it looks like, oh, what are 1,000 dots in that graph? But from those 1,000 dots and crosses, we could pull out quite informative policy decisions. The message that we translate to the line minister or the president is not the dots. They don't care. They care about these 3 lines that I put in one slide. Those are the 3 lines. After performing some analysis and after also building that trust. Because it's not that after a month of collaboration with the line minister, we present, oh, these are the 3 conclusions you should perform now. They will be like, who are you? After building that trust in almost a year process that we've been working in Botswana and Uganda, is that after that trust, they can understand and they will also trust the messages that we are performing because they have gone through the modeling exercise, now running the several hundreds or thousands of simulations and then pulling some of those key messages for policy making. So I guess local teams, we are also planning to build, and we are actually looking for potential partners in this one, planning to build training material. This is something we want to do for 2026. We're looking for funding at the moment to start putting all that training material that will also be publicly available in Open Learned, which is something CCG has been deploying. So we do have the expertise and all the material is putting all things together. As you had already used osmosis training material and clues and onset and so on, we want to develop this for robust decision making. So what is robust decision making, how you could do it, and all the exercises that you could deploy potentially and doing so. So we are looking at the moment for funding for that. I think moving on to the question from Will was, can you please remind me quickly, just one keyword?
How do you account for interrelations?
Oh, yes. So there are definitely interrelations between parameters in the analysis. We do capture those dependencies in the RDN interface. when we want to move one parameter in one way or the other, for instance, just thinking about the cost of batteries and the cost of electric vehicles, it is very unlikely that if the cost of batteries go up, then the cost of electric vehicles will go down. It's very unlikely. Why? Because they use the same battery. Ultimately, it's the same battery and just the case for the electric vehicles. So if one goes up, the other one is likely to go up as well. So these dependencies can be captured in the analysis. We need to also understand from the stakeholders what dependencies they want to explore. For instance, in land use is one challenging one, because when we discuss land use, grassland, cropland, forest, then the question is, okay, if we want to increase productivity in the country, what are we sacrificing? Forest? Are we going to move grassland to cropland and do some changes in land use? I don't want to go into the details because I think the audience is more into energy, but yeah, we need to do some land use changes. So what are those that we want to recommend as a policy, or that we are willing to do as a policy? This needs to be captured as well through the exercise of this science policy interface that we also discussed yesterday. I hope I answered the question.
Yeah, thanks. That's amazing. I'm sure that there are more questions, but we are now well into tea time. So I'm hoping it's okay that we take a 15-minute tea instead of a half-hour tea, and then we'll be back on time. So thank you, everyone. I mean, I thank you also to the three presenters. I found that a really gripping session. And thank you, Jairo.
Pleasure.